Essays 8 through 14 of It's a Good Old World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Escalera. It's a Good Old World by Bruce Barton. Essay number 8. Why not use our island of Yap? Over at Ellis Island, they are holding a big catch of anarchists and Bolsheviks, waiting for a boat to Russia whose owners don't care what kind of cargo it carries. They are not an attractive-looking crowd. Most of them were poor, oppressed refugees fleeing from government or hunger when they came to us. We took them in, warmed them, fed them, gave them more money than they had ever had before. And while we were busy in the front yard beating off a mob of Germans, they stayed behind in our home and plotted to destroy the furniture, turn out the members of the family, and keep the house and all our possessions for themselves. That sort of ingratitude, the utter lack of any moral sense, is peculiarly irritating. So our government thinks it wise to send them back where they came from, lest we might someday lose our self-control and be tempted to do them bodily injury. It is one solution of the situation, but not a very satisfactory one. They will be just as bad neighbors in any other country, and there is always the chance that they may escape and appear in our midst again. A far better way would be to deal with them as Milton tells us the first Bolsheviks were dealt with. Things in heaven were going pretty well when a crowd of ungrateful spirits, headed by a gentleman named Satan, decided to overthrow the government and seize the kingdom for themselves. They were defeated, but no attempt was made to imprison them. Instead, they were given a secluded place all their own and allowed to do with it as they would. It was an absolutely free place. No one had to work, all authority was removed. There were none of the improvements that had existed in heaven. Of course, they made a very distressing discovery. They found that the worst punishment that could be visited upon them was the necessity of living with themselves. "Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell," Satan exclaimed. He would gladly have made any surrender to get back to the heaven whose government he had sought to overthrow. But the gate was closed. I understand we received a prize at the Paris Peace Conference named the Island of Yap. I have never seen it, I do not know exactly where it is, but it sounds like a fine place to send Bolsheviks. Why not buy out the present inhabitants and turn the island over to the folks who don't like the way we run things here and are sure they could do it so much better? Let them organize to suit themselves, have no house rules except the rule that no member may leave the island. That seems to have been the divine plan of dealing with their forebears. When they rebelled against the heaven God was conducting, He gave them a heaven of their own. And they promptly made it hell. End of essay number 8. Essay number 9. The Second Mile. There is a strange fact about business that I have noticed many times. It may be expressed in this apparently senseless phrase: a little too much is just enough. A young man came to me yesterday to tell me his boss had been fired. I was sorry for the boss, glad for the young man, and glad for myself. It proved me, for once, a good prophet. For the same young man had met me 3 months ago and complained of his lot. His boss was loafing on the job, he said, leaving all the work of the department to him. "He gets the money and I do the work," the young man exclaimed. "What shall I do?" I told him to do more work. "But I'm doing too much already," he cried. "I know it," I said. "Do more. Do so much more that everybody in the office will notice it. Then see what happens." Well, it happened. The boss is fired, and he has the boss's job. I read a great deal of biography. It is my favorite kind of reading. And nothing impresses me so much as to see how hard the great men of the world have worked. Almost without exception, they have done more work than they needed to do, more work than the average man would have been willing to do, more than enough. Take this extract from a book recently published, the life of Delane, the great editor of the London Times. He read and edited himself everything that was to appear in the paper next morning: telegrams, correspondence letters, the reports of Parliament. He selected the letters addressed to the Times that were to be published. He chose the books that were to be reviewed. He was scrupulous as to the way in which even small matters of social interest were announced and handled. This method of editing was infinitely laborious. Even when the Times was much less than its present size, the task of reading, correcting, and controlling from 40 to 50 columns of new matter every night was immense. But Delane never shrank from it. I know editors getting $50 a week who would consider themselves abused beyond endurance if anyone suggested a day's work like Delane's. Doubtless there were plenty of editors in London in Delane's own day who thought him a fool to work so hard. If there were, we do not know their names. Posterity seldom does know the names of the men who are careful not to work too hard. Dickens began life as a stenographer. "How hard I worked at that tremendous shorthand and all the improvements pertaining to it!" he exclaimed. "I will only add to what I have already written of my perseverance at that time of my life and the patient, continuous energy which then began to be matured in me, and which I know to be the strong point of my character, if I have any strength at all, that there, on looking back, I find the source of my success." Bishop Butler worked 20 years on his Analogy, and then wanted to burn it because he thought it not good enough. George Eliot read more than 1,000 volumes before she began to write Daniel Deronda. Patient, continuous, ceaseless work. What the ordinary writer would have called too much, the extraordinary writer thought hardly enough. There is a verse in that great textbook on modern business, the Bible, which sums it all up. "And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain." Whosoever hires you to work 8 hours, take advantage of him by working a little longer. Whosoever compels you to do a certain task, do more than you contract to do. It's the second mile that counts. All biography is a record of that truth. All business experience attests it. The work that no man compels you to do is the work for which the world pays most. A little too much is just enough. End of essay number 9. Essay number 10. Which knew not Joseph. It's a very old story, but it never needed retelling so much as in this present hour. His name was Joseph, and he was carried away from home and found himself in Egypt, a strange new land. Because he was good looking and intelligent and a hard worker, he rose rapidly until he became prime minister. Except the king, there was no other man in Egypt more influential or more celebrated. His relatives learned of his rise with interest. They followed into Egypt, and with his help they, too, prospered and were likewise influential. It looked as though they were permanently provided for, as though nothing could happen to dislodge them. But in a single generation, yes, in a little fraction of a generation, the unbelievable occurred. The people who were so contented, so free from all concern, were hurled from their high position into the bitterness of slavery. The thing that happened to them is recorded in a single sentence. Joseph died, and there arose a new king in Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Only a few years since Joseph's death, and the new king knew nothing about him and cared less. His name had been a byword in the ancient world, but a few people passed away, some new ones were born, and presto, he was as much forgotten as though he had never lived. I would print that story large upon the office walls of thousands of men in these changing days. On the walls of businessmen, for example. Only last week I talked with a man who told me that his company controlled 75% of the business in its line a quarter of a century ago. Today, the company controls less than 20%. The men who owned it had grown self-satisfied, and almost overnight a new viral competitor arose, and with advertising pushed the older company from its place of power. Our fathers knew that older company well. but you and I have hardly heard its name. A new generation has arisen, a new king, which knows not Joseph. I would print it on the walls of writers, and of preachers, and of lawmakers, and of every man who wants to see the race progress. You think that you have told your story to the world, and that therefore your task is done. I tell you that overnight a new world has been born that has never heard your story. You think because the gospel has been preached for 1900 years that by that preaching the race must automatically be saved. Every sermon preached as long ago as yesterday is already dead. A little slackening of the effort, a little moment of self-satisfaction, and all the momentum gained by years of work is lost. For the world moves swifter today than ever before in its history. And even in the very instant of your self-content, the silence is shattered by the trampling of new feet. Behold, another generation has come, a new king who knows no precedents, in whose experience nothing is fixed. A king in whose sight yesterday has been cold 1,000 years, a king which knows not Joseph. End of essay number 10. Essay number 11. He called the president Charlie. Some weeks ago I left New York, where the talk was all of labor troubles and industrial unrest. Employers were locking the doors against their workmen, and labor leaders were calling out their followers on strike. I went up into the middle of the state to an industrial city of 22,000 people. The vice president of one of the large plants there took me around in his automobile. "Any labor trouble?" I asked. "Not a bit." "Ever had a strike?" "Not in 75 years. Why, if we didn't read the newspapers, we would hardly know what the word means." Later in the afternoon, I sat in the office of the president of another factory in the same city. It is no small plant. The owners are just breaking ground for an addition that will cost more than $1 million. Only one other company in its line does a larger annual business. As I sat talking with the president, the door opened and the shipping clerk came in. "Shall we prepay that shipment to Louisville, Charlie?" the shipping clerk asked. "We will this time, Al," the president replied. I gasped. A concern whose goods are sold from coast to coast, a concern whose owners can build $1 million addition without asking any outside help, and the shipping clerk calls the president Charlie? In that instant, a big light dawned for me. I got a picture of a social organization far different from anything we residents of the big cities know. Charlie, the president, owns his own home. So does Al, the shipping clerk. Charlie raises vegetables in the backyard to cut down his cost of living. So also does Al. Charlie's children go to the same school with Al's. Al's wife rides out occasionally with Charlie's in the automobile. And Charlie's wife calls on Al's when there is a new baby or one of the older children is sick. No jealousy, no suspicion, no profiteering on one side or holding back on the other. The company is our company, not the company, to every man and woman in it. From our present social troubles we are bound to reap some very large rewards. The troubles look black enough at times. It seems to have been decreed by Providence that the process of birth should never take place without the accompaniment of suffering and pain and tears. And it is a process of birth, not of death, that we are passing through in this reconstruction period. Out of it is going to come a new world, a world in which things will be better for the average man than they ever were before. One of the developments, in my judgment, will be the removal of a good many industries from the smoke-laden air of the cities to the pure air of the country, where every family can have a home and a garden, and a man is a personality to his employer, not a number, where it is harder to forget that the business of industry is to create human happiness as well as to multiply wealth, where men stand side by side in mutual appreciation and respect. And even a shipping clerk named Al can call the president Charlie. End of essay number 11. Essay number 12. A course of reading for a young man about to run into debt. Recently, a young man wrote to ask me how he could borrow a sum of money for a certain purpose. And I suggested that before he sought to borrow any money, he should read the biographies of Benjamin Disraeli and Balzac. I would advise any young man who contemplates running in debt to read these two books. Here is a note from Disraeli's diary, December 5th, 1836. What a tragic vision it presents! One of the most brilliant men in England hesitating to accept a dinner invitation for fear of being arrested for debt. He writes: "Our county conservative dinner, which will be the most important assembly of its kind yet held, takes place on the 9th instant. I have been requested to move the principal toast, the House of Lords. I trust there is no danger of my being nabbed, inasmuch as, in all probability, I am addressing my future constituents." In his later years, Disraeli wrote these words: "If youth but knew the fatal misery they are entailing on themselves the moment they accept a pecuniary credit to which they are not entitled, how they would start in their career, how pale they would turn, how they would tremble and clasp their hands in agony at the precipice on which they are disporting. Debt hath a small beginning, but a giant's growth and strength. When we make the monster, we make our master, who haunts us at all hours and shakes his whip of scorpions forever in our sight. Faustus, when he signed the bond with blood, did not secure a doom more terrific." How many hours of bitter agony and regret are mirrored in that paragraph! Balzac's life is even more pitiable. I know of no more pathetic picture in all history than that of this great genius, toiling relentlessly at his desk from 2 o'clock in the morning, adding story to story and novel to novel, afraid to pause for even a single hour, lest his creditors close in upon him. There are, of course, exceptional circumstances under which a young man is justified in running into debt. His debt may secure an education, for example, and so add greatly to his earning power. But be very slow to assume that your circumstances are exceptional. Before you decide that you are justified in running into debt, read the lives of these two men, and the lives of Cicero, William IV, Bret Harte, Eugene Field, and Mark Twain. They spent the best years of their lives in paying for dead horses. Each managed to be great in spite of constant, irritating financial worry. But the world will never know how much greater they might have been had their minds been wholly freed for constructive work instead of burdened with the misery of debt. End of essay number 12. Essay number 13. On meeting an insignificant man. We had invited some friends to spend the evening with us, and when they arrived, he was with them. Rather short and almost bald he was, and his hand, when he offered it, was soft and ladylike. Altogether, he seemed to me about as insignificant a bit of humanity as I had recently encountered. I rather resented the fact that he had come along to destroy the balance of the party, and for some time we quite ignored him in the conversation. Then, out of common politeness, we addressed some question to him about the war. And an amazing thing took place. The little man spoke up with an amount of information and a calm confidence that were astonishing. We led him on from point to point, and always he answered modestly, but with facts that gripped our interest. From that moment the conversation of the evening centered about him. "Who is he?" I asked my friend in a whisper as he prepared to go. And he answered, "Why, don't you know? That is Jones, one of the greatest chemists in the country. The government sent for him when war was declared, and he probably knows as much about the real inside history of the past 2 years as any man in the United States." I only hoped, as I bade him good night, that he had not guessed from my earlier attitude how very insignificant and unworthy of attention I had considered him. Once upon a time an efficiency expert boasted to me that a single glance was enough to form his judgment of a man. No matter what the circumstances of the meeting, he said, he could rely upon his first impression. Perhaps he was right, but I doubt it. Would he, I wonder, have recognized in the shabby little lieutenant named Bonaparte wandering the streets of Paris, the man of destiny who was to conquer Europe? If he had stood on the sidewalk of Philadelphia when a crude lad walked by with a loaf of bread under each arm, would he have seen beneath that rough attire the philosopher and statesman Franklin? What about U.S. Grant, the middle-aged failure, delivering wood in St. Louis, unkempt, unshaven, regarded by his neighbors as a ne'er-do-well? God sends great souls into the world clothed oftentimes in curious attire. And one misses much good fellowship who thinks that from what men seem to be he can determine offhand what they are. Along a country road in Palestine a group of tired men walked one afternoon toward sundown. "Go ahead to the next village," said their leader, "and see if there we may find a place to sleep." After a little time they returned to say that the village would not receive them. It was a busy day in the village. The inhabitants were preoccupied and proud. What were a few travel-stained pilgrims to them? They trusted their first impression. It was a group of weary fishermen whom they supposed they had refused. And so they lost for themselves and their village forever the opportunity to entertain His disciples and their Lord. End of essay number 13. Essay number 14. It's a moving picture world, and the film changes every few minutes. If someone had asked me on a certain day in 1915 to name 3 permanent human institutions, I might have answered the papacy, the Bank of England, the Tsar of Russia. Maybe, on consideration, I could have given a better answer, but offhand that sounds fairly reasonable. At 9 o'clock that morning, so far as we knew, the Tsar of all the Russias was as firm on his throne as Gibraltar. In my morning paper, at least, there was no hint to the contrary. And at 6 o'clock we opened our evening papers to discover him a prisoner, and Russia on the threshold of immediate democracy. It was the kind of mental shock that is good for us. The war was full of such shocks. We learned from it, in more dramatic fashion than ever before, this very necessary truth that nothing is fixed, nothing is sure, nothing is changeless in this whole wide world. A man told me the other day about a conversation he once held with Jay Gould. Gould got up from his desk, walked over to the wall, and pointing to a map of the United States, put his finger on the Missouri Pacific Railroad. "There," he said, "is the finest railroad property in the United States." That conversation took place only about a quarter of a century ago. A few months ago the common stock of the Missouri Pacific sold down to something like $4, and the holders of it paid an assessment of $50 a share to rehabilitate the road. So confident were the shrewd investors of New England in the everlasting prosperity of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford that they invested the funds of widows and orphans and institutions in its stock. 10 years ago there was not a banker in the United States who would have believed that stock could ever crumble away. But the impossible happened. The change came. Suppose a man graduating from college at any time in the past 25 years had wanted to pick out an absolutely safe profession, one into which no unexpected change could possibly enter. What profession would he have chosen? Teaching in a college or university, probably. University professors are almost never discharged. They are sure of work as long as children continue to be born into the world, and in old age they are taken care of by Carnegie pensions. So he might have argued to himself. But behold, there comes a world war, taking away from a quarter to 2/3 of the students of our colleges with their tuition fees. The war ends, the students return, but the dollar has so shrunk in purchasing power that every college professor in the land finds his secure living made suddenly precarious. When Darwin was making his studies in evolution, working out the law by which lower forms changed through the ages into higher, he came across certain forms of life that, for some reason or other, had been incapable of change. Their environment had shifted, but they failed to adapt themselves to the new environment. So the tide of progress moved on and left them, stranded wrecks on the shore. The business world is full of men of that sort. They say to themselves, "I know this job well enough to hold it the rest of my life. I can afford to take things a little easier. Nothing can happen now to change my life. So gradually they lose the power of adaptation, which is the power of growth. They are perfectly typified by the man described in the Bible who said to his soul, " Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease." That night he died. The one change which he had not foreseen came to him and found him unprepared. End of essay number 14.